Welcome to devMode.fm, a podcast dedicated to the tools, techniques, and technologies used in modern web development. I'm Jennifer Blumberg from Next Solutions in New York.
I'm Andrew Welch from NY Studio 107.
I'm Patrick Harrington from Mildly Geeky in Boston.
And today we have regular recurring guest Ben Croker from Put Your Lights On and special first-time guest Giel Tettelaar from Global Network Group. How are you guys doing today?
Very well, thank you. It's good to be back.
Really good, Jennifer. Thank you.
Great. So if you're at the Hoedspruit Endangered Species Center outside the Kruger Park in South Africa, watching the cheetah run in circles at 100 kilometers per hour, and your friend turns to you and says, "Bro, do you even test?" What do you say?
It's a hell of a time to start talking about testing, I suppose.
They're going really fast.
Testing is basically what you do to make sure that whatever you built or whenever you're updating something, that it keeps working according to the way you or a client wants it to work.
Okay, so just to give you my testing protocol, when I finish a Craft CMS app and I push it to production, I click around a few times. The console is usually open sometimes. I submit the forms a couple times, and then I look at it in a different browser, maybe. Does that sound like a good testing protocol?
For some sites, it is. I mean, especially if they're not too complicated. If you're just doing some basic content management, even if it's a lot of content, that should work fine. But where you really want to start getting into automated testing is if you start creating more complicated sites, or really you get into plugin development or module development, or the site starts growing. So one thing to keep in mind is if you're just making a site and then it kind of just stays where it is and you never really have to change it anymore, you don't really have to test it because you don't make that many updates to it. But if you have a client who has a wish list of features that they want to start updating and implementing, then once you start building those changes, especially if you leave a project and, for example, come back to it after a month, you might start accidentally breaking things, or things might start breaking in places that you're not even making any changes. And then it really just helps to just be sure that a test suite's run and that the basic functionality of your site keeps working as it's supposed to.
Okay.
I guess in a sense we all test, and the distinction maybe to be made is, do we use manual testing as you were describing, Jennifer? I guess we all do. We all, before we launch a site, we click around hopefully and make sure things are working. Anytime we make a change.
I just click deploy and then walk away. That's it.
Well, maybe you do that if you have your automated testing set up and you know that you're testing everything that needs to be tested. Then you maybe can be in that privileged situation of being able to deploy and walk away. That's probably what we're trying to work towards by putting automated tests in place.
So it sounds like humans can test and computers can test. And I think Giel said at the beginning that if it's a simple website, then humans can just test. But can we go deeper into when a computer is better at testing than a human? When would you want to automate tests, and what kind of tests would you automate?
At the end of the day, like I said, when it gets more complex and it costs you a lot of time to test your entire either plugin or website manually, for example, if your framework changes, if Craft releases 3.5 or 4.0, if you have to go through, especially on a more complicated site, or if you maintain 10 sites, if you have to test each individual functionality across all of those sites whenever they want an update to, for example, 3.5, that's just going to cost you a lot of time. And computers are really good at doing a lot of simple things, or even just if you give them instructions, doing a lot of things quite quickly. And so manual testing gives you the benefit of being able to see your site and being able to quickly spot bugs or just things that look a bit out of place and odd, whereas automated tests is just make sure that when you have a set list of functional requirements, that those keep working regardless of what you do.
Yeah, and also computers they're not going to complain about how boring it is, right, to do the really grunt work kind of testing that you might want to be doing. So that's another advantage, is that computers are really good at doing rote stuff, and especially stuff that people suck at or people get bored doing.
Yeah, and so a benefit is really time is money, especially if you're a freelancer. With testing, you just have to create it once, and they'll keep working pretty much regardless of what changes. And so it's really investing up front and then getting a payout later down the road.
Well, I got a question. Like, you're saying computers can test, but like, test what? And are there different kinds of tests? And you know what I mean? Like, I know what it means for a person, like generally generally to test? Because you'll say, well, I expect this to happen and that to happen, but what are different kinds of tests that can happen?
The main divide, at least how I perceive it, is whether you do unit testing, which is really more oriented towards testing individual bits of your code, and user-based testing.
What is it? Unit testing, like testing whether an inch equals an inch? Like what do you mean?
So let's say you have you maintain the SEOmatic plugin, and you have a method that generates a bit of JSON LD structure or something for Google, right? A meta tag. You might just call that individual method, supply it with some parameters, and test that it's returning just that tag. That's quite useful, especially if if plugin developers or module developers are relying on that method to keep working, regardless if you're making changes. But that's not the way that SEOmatic would really get used. So what you do then, if you want to test it, how a user would test it, is do something like a functional test, which actually, for example, renders your twig template and then sees that all the tags are in place. And so it's really the difference between testing the individual APIs of your PHP class or of your plugin versus just rendering a twig template and being able to play with it as it were instructions you were giving to a fellow developer to test your site.
All right. Well, since you're calling me out on the testing in my plugin, so first thing I did is when people were talking about testing, I whined and complained and said I'm not going to do it until Craft builds in some kind of testing framework to make this a reasonable thing to do. Because while you could do it on your own, it's not really that practical to test a plugin unless you're testing the whole environment that it lives in.
Yeah.
Right. So that was my first excuse. And then you came along and you created a testing framework for Craft.
Yeah, I kind of woke up one day and thought I need to call out Andrew and get him to start testing. So.
Yeah. So then you did that, and you can talk more, or Jennifer will probably have you elaborate more on that. But you implemented the testing framework in Craft, and now I don't really have an excuse, but I still have not implemented testing in my plugins. And I actually have had a couple of instances come up lately where people have commented on a regression or an issue in GitHub issues, and they said, "Wouldn't this be a good place for a test?" And I'm just like, "Yeah." Yeah.
What were those specific things? Like what do you think Giel or Ben? What do you think Andrew should write his first test to do on SEOmatic?
Well, it's a very different situation when you're starting, with a blank sheet, or you're starting with a plugin that's been around for how many years and how many major versions has it gone through? I think you're on major version 3, and it's probably been 3 years.
Too many. We've been married a long time. The 7-year itch is going on. Like, yeah. It's been a while.
So one of the tricky parts is knowing what to test, and to try and now go and get 100% code coverage with tests in a plugin as complex as SEOmatic would be a huge challenge, and probably not worth the effort, to be honest. But I think that's one of the big questions when it comes to testing. What do we choose to test? For me, it's always like what's more important is the quality of the tests rather than trying to get that 100% code coverage to say that every piece of my code is tested, because unit tests can test the smallest of units. You can add 2 numbers and test that the result equals what you expect. But where's the benefit there? In saying that, though, I was chatting with a few people the other day, and I kind of mentioned that as well. And then one of them brought up a situation in which he had a plugin that did some sort of e-commerce. It was calculating totals, or the total of several subtotals, and for some reason it was off by a few cents every time. And once he caught it, he realized that they were floating point numbers, and that the precision was causing it. So it was a few cents. You might think, oh, well, no big deal. But when it comes to e-commerce and tax, it is a big deal. So even little things like that, like, calculating totals, there probably is an argument to be made that does need testing. The way I look at it is I first try to make sure that I have tests in place for any mission critical features. So anything, with calculating totals, especially if we're talking about taking payments in e-commerce. I have plugins that will send mass mails to mailing lists, right? So I want to test that only people who are subscribed to those mailing lists end up getting an email, and that they don't get duplicate emails. And for example, that when they choose to subscribe or unsubscribe, that actually works rather than having an undesirable effect. So my approach is look for the mission critical features and start writing tests for those. And the other use case might be, well, when a bug does come in and is reported, especially from somebody who's a user of the plugin, write a test to ensure that that bug is not only fixed, but that it doesn't spawn other bugs, because often bugs are sneaky little things. And what tends to happen is that sometimes you fix a bug in one place and it spawns another bug in another place, and you don't catch it until the next person has an issue.
You just nailed what I think my approach is going to be, Ben, in terms of adding the testing in, because I'll tell you a little story. So this is the real world thing that happened. And it was with my plugin Retour that someone came to me and they said, hey, everything's working great, except we have this weird penetration testing software that it's putting line breaks into the redirect URLs. Like, I don't know when, why, or how it's happening, but it's something that it is doing. So it's inserting these things into it. And he said, okay, can you make it so that this gets stripped out? And I said, sure. I'll make it sure that this gets stripped out. Right then and there is when I should have written a unit test for that particular function that would take, some inputs, including some URLs that were malformed with line feeds in them or whatever, and tested that. I didn't do that. I fixed that. Then someone came to me later on and said, hey, I really want to redirect to this URL that has some letters with German umlauts in them. And so I put in something that would... And that wasn't working. And the reason it wasn't working is because what I did for the line feeds is I used PHP's built-in var filter, and I passed it a constant for some kind of a URL filter, right? Which correctly filters out German umlauts, because those should be URL encoded before they go into the URL. Right. So because it was using that, it broke this other guy. So I'm like, okay, I'll go in and fix that for you. Fixed it for him. Now the guy who had the issue with the line feeds comes back and says, hey, it's breaking again. So perfect case where if I had implemented that bug fix, if I had added a unit test that verified that bug fix, it would have caught this issue, and it could be a way for me to kind of slowly add these tests in a meaningful way. So that I think that's going to be my approach to adding testing into this stuff, is whenever I fix a bug and it's a reasonable case for a unit test, like that's how I'm going to start adding them in. Like, what do you think, Giel? Is that reasonable way to approach it?
No, I mean, it is, and it makes a lot of sense. And that's how we do it as well. I mean, we didn't, once we finished writing the testing framework, go, okay, we're now going to spend 5 months writing tests for everything, because we get to work on some bigger plugins in-house. So it would just take a lot of time. So our approach has really been two-pronged. We see when bugs come in and then just patch them and write a test for them. But also, when we plan features and we have to start making changes to either methods or just adding completely new concepts to whatever plugin we're working on, we immediately write a test for that. Or when we have to start changing things, write a test for it first and then change it, because the beauty of that is then you immediately know, okay, if you change something or you added a feature, if the test fails, you kind of have an idea, okay, I need to watch out for that, and it prevents you being caught out. That was really useful for us.
Yeah, I find that when we add new features to an existing code base, that's a really important time to add tests when possible, because it's so easy to lose track of the scale of our systems and how they integrate with each other, and especially a Craft plugin, right? Because a Craft plugin is intimately tied to Craft, but can also work with methods that Yi makes available and even other plugins. So changing code in one part of the system can often have a knock-on effect in other parts of the system.
We had an interesting thing where we upgraded from Craft 3.3 to 3.4, and the tests immediately caught out this SQL bug where we were searching through an element, but also, we were searching through the element, but also joining a bunch of tables. And that was a bug in 3.3 that they fixed for 3.4. But I completely forgot about that. So when we did Composer update, that part of the app just broke, and it might have been something that I would have missed because it was kind of hidden behind 2 layers of other features.
That's a really good, not even a feature that you added to your plugin, it's a feature or something that Craft added in one of their versions. And
it was something we patched over, and because of the change, and I don't specifically remember what use case why it broke, but because of what Craft changed, the patch broke. And so in that sense, it's really nice that a test just tells you, okay, fix that, without having a client call you up on a Friday afternoon saying, I can't search through my criteria, what's going on? Because if you want to get to the essence of what you're trying to prevent with testing, I think, in my opinion, that's it. Preventing clients or users from having to report bugs to you, because it's annoying for them. I personally always find it frustrating because you have to drop whatever you're doing and fix it. And having a computer tell you that is much easier. beforehand.
The fact that the testing framework now exists makes me really wish that I had done test-driven development from the start. But I kind of would have been difficult to do because the testing framework wasn't there at the time. And honestly, the task of having to go back and retrofit it has just made me, it just seems like Ben was saying earlier, just way too much work. So I think the approach that I'm going to take is get the test bed up and running, and then just as things come in, start adding them. And Jennifer, have you done stuff with test-driven development? I know it's a big thing in the Laravel world and in some Node.js stuff. Have you done anything with that?
Yeah, well, we've used PHP unit tests here and there, depending on the size of the project. Well, we often have the excuse that testing adds too much to our coding burden. So if we were to test everything, we would double the amount of code. And we sometimes do this thing where we just let the clients test for us, but less and less these days as we write more important and more crucial software. But we haven't yet used the testing framework for Craft, that's why I'm really excited to talk to you guys about it, because apparently you know quite a lot about it. It's got this cool name. Is it Codeception?
Yeah.
Well, maybe tell us about Codeception, because for me and for maybe the listeners who use Craft a lot but have never written a test, why Codeception is cool and how to use it.
So Codeception is a testing framework for PHP, and there are a couple of them out there. If you come from a JavaScript background, it's like Cypress, but then for PHP. And the really cool thing about Codeception is it combines 3 different types of tests. And obviously now, if you use Craft CMS, it comes with built-in support for Craft through the framework. So what Codeception essentially does is it takes PHP unit, which is basically the go-to standard for unit testing in PHP, which is a type of testing, and it bundles that along with its own functional testing implementation and acceptance testing, which is more testing from the user perspective, using for example Selenium, which is a kind of virtual web browser that essentially can replicate Chrome. And so it basically means that with one framework you can do all the kinds of tests required for your project. And it also means you can scale, so you can start off quite small, and then if you start adding really complicated plugins, or if you have to install commerce and do a bunch of stuff with tax rates, then you can also know you have the benefit of having PHP unit in there. It's all through one common API and syntax.
So Codeception is not Craft specific, or it is?
No, it isn't. So
Okay.
what we ended up doing was we built a module. So Codeception has a module architecture, and we built a module on top of the existing G2 module. So basically the Craft framework plugs into Codeception and then adds methods like syncing with project config, which is obviously Craft specific. But Codeception is just a standalone framework. So you can use it for Laravel or for Zend or for your G2 project if you want to, even for WordPress if you want to go crazy.
No, we don't.
WordPress would just fail the tests every time for me. So
It's just an error message, just pick another CMS.
Patrick, just want to make sure you're awake.
I am, yeah. Giel, I saw your talk at .all, and I came out of there thinking, this looks amazing. I want to go home and start it. There's, like a magic command you can run. Like everyone's Craft site already has a superpower that can generate tests. And of course, I didn't do that. I came home and quickly forgot about it. I just ran it now, though. And now I have like a folder. So I have a folder of tests. So how does someone get started? Like whether it's they want to test their own module code or they want to test other things, how does it, for things that are like dependent on what's in the database, can it work with that? Like what are some practical things that people could do?
Yeah. So, I mean, the really basic way I would recommend getting started is just running that command. So it's something like test/generate or whatever it is now. And it'll basically set up an entire test suite for you in your website or for your plugin. And then it also sets up test classes. So what I'd recommend is just to get familiar with it, run those tests because they're really basic and they just assert that Craft is installed. And that's essentially it. Then once you're up and running and you've scrolled through the Codeception docs a little bit, just to get a feel, I would just write one functional test where you just do some basic assertions on a twig template, because essentially for most Craft sites you'll either have the GraphQL API or you have some kind of twig template that does something, and the easiest way to get started is doing it from a user perspective, because in my opinion it feels the most familiar, so it also seems the easiest to read. I mean, unit testing is quite technical and it's not the easiest place to get started, and the difficult thing is if you haven't done a bit of research into it, the unit tests you write initially, when you look back on them after 6 months, you end up finding you just want to delete them and start over. I mean, that's what I had when I initially got started, and that in my opinion, slowed me down a bit. Whereas most of the functional tests, because they essentially just read as instructions, they're pretty straightforward.
Let me ask you a question about that, Giel. So let's say that I use something like Scrutinizer CI or some kind of an automated CI tool. Is there a way that these tests can just be run automatically when I push changes to my plugin or website or module in my website or whatever? And how does that look? Like, how does it spin up inside of Scrutinizer or other CI tools and have a seeded database so it can actually bootstrap Craft outside of an environment?
So I don't know about Scrutinizer CI, but I've worked with Travis, which is just another CI. And the Craft docs documentation actually has a page on how to get started on that. But essentially what you just do is you can give something like Travis instructions to just set up and install Craft just through console commands, like you would just setting up a regular site. And then you can just run Codeception on it. And the beauty about how I've seen Travis be implemented is it runs all of your tests after each commit or pull request to a master branch, which means, especially for plugins, you immediately know if there's a pull request open, then it immediately checks, does this break anything in unexpected places? And you get an email if it does break something, so you can immediately go fix it. And then the other good alternative is in your deployment pipeline, in your deployment tools, you can often set it up some way that it runs your tests before it actually pushes any code to the server. That way, if the tests do break, nothing actually gets shipped to production and you get a message. And that's, in my opinion, that's probably utopia, because that just means that you can just keep on coding, and if something does break, you can just go back and fix it without any harm being done.
Yeah, so if you're using something like buddy.works where it's spinning stuff up in a Docker container or whatever, you can have it run the tests. And I guess as part of that, you would have to have it probably pull the live database down just so it's got something to run in, and probably you want that updated.
It depends. I mean, it's not the way I would do it or the way that we do it here. So you can set up data with fixtures, which is a whole separate thing to talk about that Ye2 provides. And it basically allows you to, from a PHP array, it will populate the rows in your database. And the other thing, and that's what we do just because it's the easiest, is we just run an SQL script beforehand that just sets up our entire data structure. Just because we have a lot of tables, and if we have to manage all of that through fixtures, including all of the relations, I haven't found a way to make it not become completely unwieldy.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering, because what if I have tests that are very specific to the data that has been entered in the CMS? How do I do that?
So,
and Ben was shaking his head at me like, you dummy, you're doing it wrong. Like, Ben, tell me how to do this.
No. You make a very good point. And to go back to your earlier point of you were waiting for the testing framework to come along for Craft before adding tests to your plugins, I completely agree. And this is something I think is important to highlight, that this is part of what the testing framework adds, which is the ability to create these fixtures, or these are fixtures you can think of as creating dummy data that you can then run your tests on. And the reason we need a database to run the tests on, obviously, is because we want to run tests on things that we know, like entries, categories, sections, users. So we need the database, but not only that, we need to mock those objects and populate the database so that we can run those tests using Craft. And I'm not sure if fixtures is a Codeception or Ye2 feature, but either way, Craft has its own fixture so that it makes it very easy to populate the database with sample set of entries or any element type, really.
But what if I want to test the actual database? Like, what if there is stuff on the website that I need to test that? I don't want to test like some contrived data. I'm doing an acceptance test or something based on the data that the client or someone else has entered in the website. What do I do then?
Oh, I see. So you want to test against live data from a live website.
Well, so a simple example. Right. So let's say there was a content builder, and it would be impractical for me to handle every permutation of what could possibly be in there, or maybe there are different code paths based on, certain things. And I want to be able to test it against what the client has actually put in there to make sure that this page outputs what I think it should based on, what they've put in their matrix builder, so that a contrived test wouldn't necessarily catch that. Is that a thing? Or
I guess the argument is that when you write your tests, you can populate it with random data, or you could populate it with sample data, or you could populate it with anything, but you can run that test 1,000 times. It's kind of like, monkeys, 100 monkeys typing on a... Yeah. So you can sample more use cases than you could from, pulling down data from your client site.
Okay. So that makes sense.
I don't know.
Just cover all the permutations, but I'm a little worried you're seeking PETA is going to come after us now for these monkeys. But Giel, What were you going to say, Giel?
Look, the difficult thing with using a live site, unless it's, for example, a staging site, is the content might change. So you might, for example, you might run an assertion that a title of an entry page gets populated. But if a user then goes in and changes that title because it's a live site, or he might change the content, then that assertion will fail. Whilst the site is still working fine because the user just went in and changed the content. And so that's kind of why with testing, it's important that you have some kind of seed data that is consistent and kind of independent of what test you run. And so it's difficult to use that type of, but what you can do is, for example, with acceptance testing, is just run a separate web server that isn't the actual site, but you could just feed it with example data. So for example, staging, if you're sure the content isn't going to change, you could run your tests against that.
I think the distinction is that we're trying to create automated tests to test the features of our websites rather than the content contained in those.
Mm-hmm.
I guess where I'm coming at this from is that, and any programmer will realize this, that when you're writing code, you're thinking to yourself about what the inputs are going to be, and you're kind of doing things carefully to guard against, certain things. But a lot of the bugs that I run into are the inputs coming in as something I just never expected that it would be. So or users using the tool in ways I just never thought that they would. So how do you simulate that? Or do you just add it as a test as it happens?
Look, you can't, in my opinion, you can't plan for every scenario. I mean, you can get really creative and perhaps invite other people who haven't written the code to try and use your application and see what they do with it, and then test against that. But even if you have 100% coverage and you have all kinds of tests set up, whether it be user centric and unit tested, your app could still fail because someone might enter a character that you're not expecting, or they might enter a Chinese character and something breaks there.
Nah, bro. No. My code's got 100% coverage. It's bulletproof. Nothing's ever going to go wrong. What are you talking about?
You mentioned, Giel, in your talk that you should not test the UI. You should rather test the controllers. What did you mean by that?
So basically, for example, with acceptance testing, you can test that particular markup is returned, or that something is being styled in a particular way, or that you're doing things that particular classes are being added. And that's all great. But fundamentally, what you should rather test is that the Twig templates are actually returning the right data. That, for example, when you push a search button, that it's actually returning the correct results. And that's the context of my talk was more looking at it from a codeception perspective. And with so many people moving to Vue.js now, or React, or whatever app framework that you're working towards, that has its own testing ecosystem. So if you want to look at them more from a UI perspective, you might want to get into those tests because it's much more focused, and it means they make a lot more sense rather than using codeception to test a Vue application, which isn't really possible.
Yeah, my first introductions to testing have been as a result of pull requests, where I did some pull requests for people, and they're like, "That's wonderful that you got this feature. Now, can you write a test for it? Because we're not going to accept it unless there's a test." I'm like, okay, yeah, that sounds pretty reasonable. So, I mean, that was kind of my introduction to testing. But I guess I've got a question that I kind of wish Matt was on here, but Matt couldn't make it. But Giel, maybe you'll know. So how much is Pixel and Tonic using this testing framework? Like, what kind of coverage do they have of the CMS?
I mean, that's difficult because, Pixel and Tonic, in that sense, at least from my perspective, they're in a unique position where they each have their own specialized domain in the CMS. Except for Brandon, who appears to know everything. They seem to be able to do a lot of things without breaking the CMS too badly. They seem to have it relatively under control. I know they're adding tests, and I know they have a bunch of plans, but I think their priority right now is Craft Cloud, and I think they've kind of put that ahead. And so how I see them doing it now is mostly maintaining what tests there are. And if they make changes to methods or to parts of the code base that are tested, to make sure that they expand or update those tests rather than actively adding many tests of their own.
Does the framework that you wrote on top of Craft use codeception tests? Whew, that's like really meta.
Yeah,
Does
so
codeception use codeception?
So I know that the tests that are actually written for Craft, which you can actually see, they're pretty good. Some of them are pretty good examples of how you can test your application, for example. That just uses its own testing frame. It uses a whole bunch of the features from its own testing framework as well.
So what percentage coverage do you think we have? If you had to guess from Craft CMS itself.
I haven't worked on it since the summer of last year. When I left, when I rounded off the testing framework, we were at about 22%, I think.
Okay. Yeah, so you're very diplomatic for a 17-year-old, by the way. That's very good. No, I was just wondering because I realize that their focus is on Craft Cloud, but again, Craft Cloud is going to be based on the same code base. And if we're talking about all these benefits of testing, I would expect that they would reap them no matter where they were.
Look, I mean, I think it's a good example of how difficult it is to get started. Because I mean, I talk with them a lot, and it's quite clear that they see the benefit of testing, and they really want to get started. And they've been quite active in getting the framework up and running, and helping me out with some of the questions that I had. So they've put a lot of time into this. The flip side is, they have many users with other requests. They have I think 1,000 issues open now with people wanting various things to be added. And I mean, you can't cater to everyone, and then it's just the temptation to build a feature rather than to test one. I mean, that's pretty great. I mean, I've noticed that as well, because I mean, we have a relatively decent amount of codeception coverage now, but everything with us is Vue applications. Everything is Vue, and I have no JavaScript tests because I haven't even learned anything about it. I haven't had the time to dive in. So that's even if I have relatively good testing on the PHP side, the user side, which is in my opinion pretty important as well, nothing. And that kind of just does highlight, even if you get started on it, it's really difficult, especially retrofitting something as big as Craft.
Right. And believe me, like, I'm not trying to call them out here. I'm more just curious because I'm wondering, how much of the framework have they adopted? Because, I haven't even adopted any of it. I know Ben has adopted testing in some of his plugins. Ben also did a really nice course on plugin testing on craftquest.io that I figured we should mention. Yes, Ben?
That wasn't me, though. That was Ryan Ireland. He did the introduction to testing Craft CMS.
I know that Ryan Ireland, for instance, did a really good testing framework set of tutorials on craftquest.io, for instance.
No, Ben was on there. I just looked at it. Was that not... What? Am I confused?
Oh, you're confusing me now. Not the testing part, though. I've done videos for sure. Yeah, but
only a
that's
fool
more
would
plugin,
think. Yeah.
plugin development, not testing.
Jennifer's totally confused. Anyway,
could have sworn that it was you, but okay.
Anyway, my point is that I'm not trying to call out Pixel and Tonic. I'm more just curious, like, what it looks like for them to get coverage, right? Because it's obviously very important, but it's something that even they are just like, well, there's only so much we can do. Let's do the most important things.
I mean, I just checked. If you go to codecov.io, Craft CMS has a subscription to that, so you can essentially see for yourself how much coverage they have. So they're at 24% now,
right?
And knowing from what I worked on with them a while ago, there's just a couple of features that are really tested quite well. So the GraphQL stuff, Andres did a great job on getting all of that tested. So that's at 90% now of the coverage, and the whole search. Yeah, the search, all of Craft search functionalities that has 100% testing. Most of it now.
If you think of how big the Craft code base is, 24% is pretty
huge.
reasonable.
It's huge. It's monstrous. And if it's the most important 24%, I'm sure that it's for some projects, 24% coverage might be all that you need, depending on what it is that it does.
Yeah, and maybe if the GraphQL stuff has got testing as well, pretty complete testing, then that maybe is a sign that anything new that they build, they're going to also do it with either test-driven development or just writing tests for the features.
Which is exactly what you were saying, which is that when you're approaching a new project, it's easier to build it in than it is to go back to an old project and try to retrofit it. It's kind of like, if you've got this old house that you've lived in for forever and you want to go back in and try and run Ethernet through all the walls. Well, I mean, you could be in just a world of pain trying to do that. But if you're building a brand new house, man, it's real easy to spec it out and get an Ethernet jack in every room in the house.
Look, I mean, my take on it is I think they've done a really good job getting it started. I'm curious to see what they're going to do with testing with Craft Cloud. What approach they're going to take there. I mean, my guess would be looking at how Andres did it, that all the new features and that they're going to implement testing for it. So I'd be curious if they release any plugins, how they end up doing that.
Okay. But speaking of which, this ties right into something else that it's mea culpa again. So the other thing I complained about was I'm like, oh, it would be really nice, Giel, if there was a testing framework for plugins. How about you do a pull request and add that to pluginfactory.io? And you did, right?
Yeah, again, I felt like I needed to give Andrew a kick up the butt, so I thought, how can I do that?
Yeah.
Careful what you wish for.
And so Giel did it, and I still have not merged the PR.
He's your canary, man. You found your canary.
It's on my list. I actually just did a decent update to Plugin Factory, and I wanted to just get like all the stable PRs like done and all the bugs fixed and all that kind of stuff. And I added a sponsorship page on GitHub in case anyone wants to buy me a coffee or a beer for maintaining that thing. But I think the next thing that I'm going to do on it is I'm going to look at integrating the testing framework, because I think you both, or everyone is right, that it's a lot easier to do from the start, and it really should be baked into the framework that Plugin Factory generates for people. So the tests are right there, they're in their face, and they can jump in and get started with it.
So will that just be the overall scaffolding, or would you be able to say, oh, I want to test a specific thing and generate it?
No, so what it does now is it essentially does what the craft command does, only it sets it up specifically for your plugin or your module. So it namespaces everything correctly, and it sets up some dummy tests as examples. That's it. But you could go a lot farther in setting up tests for each individual, service class and functional test for all the controllers that you generate for it.
Something I always do is I ask people, like, when is it going to be done, or when is that feature going to be out? So I'm going to curse myself, and I'm going to say that by the time this episode is out, that PR is going to be merged in, and Plugin Factory is going to be generating tests. Oh my God. Okay, sorry, Ben, go ahead. What were you going to say?
Yeah, it's already live. So you can try it today, listeners.
Exactly. No, I think that's going to be extremely helpful, because the great thing about Plugin Factory is that it gives you this base to look at and to experiment with and start using. You can install a plugin, right, and start seeing how it works. And it's going to be the same with sample tests. And I think that's the big hurdle that many people need to get over. Okay, just seeing, okay, what's a basic test? How does it work? And how can I extend that to do, what I need to test for? And once you're past that, it's just, a matter of figuring out what you want to test. But that's the big hurdle to get over.
Look, I mean, Plugin Factory is where at least I started, and I'm assuming it's the case for more people. It's where a lot of plugin developers or module developers start out, because it's pretty much the go-to resource. Everyone recommends it. So if it starts off with tests, then it's much more likely to just ignite a spark with a new class of developers to go, okay, I'm going to do some basic tests for whatever I'm releasing.
I 100% agree, and that's why I'm taking the pledge that I'm going to have it merged in there by the time this episode goes out and comes live. But Giel, I've got questions for you. Are you some kind of like Superman or something? Like you built this whole testing framework for Craft, and then you built the testing scaffolding for Plugin Factory. Like, how do you do it, man?
The funny story is it started with the whole testing framework actually started with about a 5-minute conversation between Brad and I on the rooftop at .all 2018 in Berlin.
Were drinks involved?
I was not of age, so I'm not going to answer that. But we were talking about a talk that went, and that kind of mentioned testing. And I was talking to Brad, and he's the one who's really active within Pixel and Tonic, and saying, look, let's get testing done, and let's start doing, some kind of test-driven development, and motivating everyone else on the team. And so I said, look, if I can just help out, do a basic pull request, just with some starting tests and a basic module that just does the absolute necessity for you guys to get started with it, I'm happy to do it. And then over the winter break and during Christmas, I had some time left, and that plugin, that pull request, just ended up growing and growing and growing until it was absolutely ridiculous. I think it was about 15,000 lines that it added.
Oh my God.
And the whole initial framework, and about, I think, 5 or 7% of the entire Craft code base was tested then.
What did Brad put in your drink?
I mean, look, I think I just ended up getting lucky, because a lot of the work was completed summer last year. I was just lucky that we were ahead of our release schedule, and we just kind of ended up making the decision, what do we want to build now? Are we going to build a bunch of new features, or are we going to end up, testing some of the things that we've already built before we go ahead? We have this pull request that was already open at the time. And so we just ended up saying, because we're a team of 3, I just ended up saying, the other 2 guys, you guys focus on new features, and I'll just commit myself for about 3 months to just building this plugin and making sure that there's a testing framework in place that we can use. That was kind of the story. And yeah, Pixel and Tonic put in an insane amount of time to help me get started. And I think, that the end result is pretty awesome.
Well,
and
to see is, like, people that are not of age, usually they're doing stuff like putting a blink tag on an HTML page. Like, had you done much testing prior to this?
I mean, putting blink tags on an HTML page is essentially my full-time job. So. No, I mean, the funny thing is, the first tests I wrote were in that pull request. That's how I got into it.
Wow.
Which also, that's great, because for me, I can look back and see some of the tests that are actually still in there and go, ooh, I would have done that a different way. I hope no one ever looks at that again. But it's nice to be able to see, okay, where I started off and see what things I learned across the way. And I think that's interesting if other people dive into there as well, especially if you have some experience with testing.
What if you don't? Like, I think a lot of people on the Craft Discord, it seems to me that they don't have a lot of PHP experience at all. I mean, I think Craft is unique in a way you can write a huge website without writing any PHP. So if I mean, how experienced do you need to be to start writing tests? Like, were you quite experienced with web development, with PHP development before? Do you think that you need to be?
No, I mean, I don't think you necessarily need to be. I mean, you need to take a PHP basics course. I mean, that's because you need to understand the syntax and how classes work and how all of that works. So you need some kind of basic background. And if you just get Twig, it's quite easy to learn, but you do need to have some kind of understanding of that. I mean, I mostly just do backend and view development. So in that sense, even 2 years ago, I had the experience to be able to dive into the inner workings of Codeception and see, okay, how does the module architecture work? But if you're just starting out and you run that console command, if you run the console commander and just start up some basic functional tests, it's quite easy, because the beauty of those types of tests is they essentially read as an instruction script that you would give to a fellow developer or just to your client to test the application, or that your client would give to you. So it's structured very much in a way that it reads like it's human instructions, which makes it quite easy to get started. I mean, I suppose everyone learns in their different way, and I can't really say how easy it is if you have no PHP experience, but the syntax isn't that complicated.
Well, how about this? Is it safe to say that anyone who is writing any kind of plugin or module, however small, if they're capable of doing that, I think they're very capable of adding the tests, right? So if you're already, even if it's a small custom module, just add a little bit of functionality, or it's a little bespoke plugin that you need for whatever. If you're doing that, you can already do the testing. So getting this integrated into Plugin Factory is, I think it's a no-brainer, because anyone who's doing that already is definitely capable of doing this. The question I have, which is kind of sort of similar to that, is, okay, so testing is wonderful for Pixel and Tonic. It's something that plugin developers should be doing. It's something that people that are writing custom modules probably should be doing. What about people that are just building a website? If I'm just building a website, am I going to implement any kind of testing in there, or when would I want to do that? Maybe acceptance testing for what's on there, that type of thing?
Look, I mean, the basic website, the beauty of it, if it's just a website, it's quite simple. You don't need that many tests to cover most of the functional requirements of that website. I mean, if we're just talking about a content site with a search functionality, all you really have to do is 2 functional tests. One where you just enter a search keyword and see that it returns a particular set of entries or products or user, and one where you just check that all the Twig templates are rendering and that blog articles are being pulled in from the right place and the archive is being pulled in from the right place. That is essentially those are just 2 tests.
And you could implement a test to make sure that the reading time on your article really is 5 minutes. If it's, you could test that. Right?
Yeah, I mean, and I mean, as your site grows, if you have, for example, you just have a content site, but with a really complicated search functionality, then that's what you test, and you just test that when you enter a particular keyword and that it has to relate to, and you enable that it has to relate to a particular category, that it actually pulls those things in. And so even if you have a really basic site, the tests you have to write for it are really basic. And so the only thing you really need to consider is it, does my client require it? If it's just a site that you set up once and they're never going to have you look at it again, or you just have to run craft updates and you're not using any custom modules or plugins, you might not have to write tests for it. I mean, it's not necessarily, it won't be likely you immediately break things if you just do basic Twig adjustments. But like I said at the beginning, if the client has a whole bunch of wish lists for the future, once their business grows, you might want to plan on having some kind of test system in place that, especially once you add those new features, that you can test for it as well.
Yeah, especially that e-commerce example you mentioned where the cents were off. That could be a huge thing. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned that a lot of people start with Plugin Factory. This might surprise you, I don't know, but I still use it. Anytime that I'm making a new anything, I still generate the scaffolding from there and start with that.
I mean, if you write a test, I mean, the thing about the cents being off because of rounding, let's say you write a piece of code and then you write a test that piece of code works. I mean, what if you're wrong in your code and you're wrong in your test, and then you think that because the test passed, you think that everything's hunky-dory. So is there a way to test for that? Sort of, turtles all the way down kind of thing?
Oh my God, this is like the recursion test.
I don't think developers make mistakes.
That's a good point.
So we're safe. We're good there.
Actually, so this is a good opportunity. So this is, I'll test your skills, Giel. We'll see how good you are. Okay.
No,
Or actually,
this-
everybody here, everybody here does some PHP. Okay. So let's do a little test here. So let's say that you're testing. Okay. So you've got the number 2.2. So you set a variable equals 2.2 minus 1, and then you say if this resulting variable equals 1.2, do something, right? So that should work every single time, right? Because 2.2 minus 1 is 1.2. And we're saying if this variable equals 1.2, then do something. That will fail every single time. Does anyone know why?
Floating point precision.
You're right. So how do we guard against that? So basically what happens is, and this is a problem that I just ran into, and I've been aware of this for a long time, but just totally blew it when I was writing the code. Whenever you do any kind of arithmetic with floating point numbers, the result is an approximation, right? So you're doing 2.2 minus 1. A rational human says that's going to be 1.2. Like I know what that is. But in floating point, the mantissa part of it, the part after the decimal, it's an approximation of what it is.
Like a wild fraction. Yeah.
Yeah. So in reality, it ends up being some weird thing that is like, in this case, it would probably be something like 1.1999999 or something weird like that. And so if you typecast the thing to a string, it does the right thing and it converts it into 1.2. Or if you round it to, however many digits, then it converts it to the right thing. But that's what you have to do with floating point numbers before you convert them. And the reason why I'm going into this is that this is the kind of weird, arcane, obscure thing that would be beautiful to test, right? Especially involving commerce, when you're involving money, where lots of math that's happening with money, lots of people getting in trouble if the math is wrong having to do with money,
Yeah, so I mean, that's obviously just because I've come across it. I know Codeception and inherently through a PHP unit, they provide a method that allows you to compare two floats, and it basically checks that there's a particular delta between the two numbers, and it adds an error margin. So I mean, that's one of those things where the framework can often jump in and help you, and those are, especially with tax rates in commerce, that's something that really is served well by a PHP unit test.
And to go back to your original question, Jennifer, I think like we were talking about unit testing earlier, we can test that calculating those totals result in the correct amount. We can also test those on the front end though, right? We can test that when you add these 3 products to your shopping cart, that when you go to the checkout page, that the total of all of those products adds up to the right amount. And the way that we do that, as Giel was kind of talking about with acceptance or functional tests, is really in quite plain English. So you say, I'm on this page and I should see these 3 products, and I fill in this field and I click on submit, and then I should see this on the next page. And I think that's maybe where acceptance tests are really useful. When you're submitting forms, you want to make sure that there isn't an error or a page not found that comes back. You want to make sure that you're brought to the next success page, for example, with the appropriate success message. And that's where we can test the front ends of our craft sites with the Twig templates, for example.
Look, for the people that really learn by just reading code and seeing how something's implemented in practice and then playing around with it, if you go to the Craft CMS code base and you're in some way familiar with that, there are functional tests that test how you save a user. So it basically just goes it goes to the page /user/new, and it just fills out a form and then sees, okay, a user has been added to the database. Just in about 20 lines, it's tested a really important part of Craft and made sure that it got through that without any errors. And then you can further dive down into it by checking, okay, is the validation working? You can do those type of tests in unit or functional as well. But just those basic tests of seeing, like Ben said, a product is added to the cart, that's a really good starting place for a functional test. And then later on, you can dive in and see, okay, is the tax rate calculated correctly?
Right. And those functional tests are very high level tests. So they will permeate down through the stack trace, for example, and catch a lot of potential errors further down.
In the case of that register user specifically, I mean, would you then also have to set up like a fake mail server where the email would be sent out to the user and then have something that reads the email and clicks on the link that goes to activate it? And
so basically what we built for that, because that's kind of a recurring problem, right? You send a mail, and what you don't want from a testing environment is that people start getting 100 mails. You don't want to get 100 emails either from your SMTP server, because that's just going to ruin your account usage, which I may have learned the hard way. But basically, what we do is we built in an inbuilt system that essentially catches emails. So this is Craft specific, but it catches emails before they're sent out, and so it basically means it renders those emails. So you can actually check the HTML of that email, but it won't actually be sent, which essentially means that you can actually read the email and see are all the links in there and are they correct, and does it have the activation code without your system actually sending an email.
That's really cool. I've done something kind of like that with Mailhog, just in local dev, but this is built into it. That's really cool.
Yeah, so I mean, it's on the documentation, and it's a bit hard to explain without sitting in front of a computer. But if you just go to the docs and it just says sending mails under the tests, it'll just explain how that works. And it's just one method, and it'll just grab the email that was just sent, and that you can just play around with that email and check that everything that was supposed to be on there is on there.
I think what is really hard to understand is how we're recording this podcast not sitting in front of a computer. Like, that's incredible, Giel. How are you doing that?
Black magic.
Black magic.
I just have one more question, I think, before we wrap up. So you guys both mentioned, well, reading the code is a great way to get started. And then there's the Craft Quest course. What are the other resources for people who've never tested that will help them get started writing their first test?
Obviously, the Craft specific, Craft Quest is probably the best place to start, and the documentation. If you want to get a more general idea of how testing works, there's a couple of great resources in the Laravel environment that just explain the basics of what testing is, what are the various types of testing. So you just get familiar with the concept of it, and then you can dive into the Craft stuff specifically.
I think one of the best ways to learn about testing is to close your eyes and think back to that time when you pushed a change to production without checking it, and it brought the entire site down. The client was hounding you and was yelling at you about stuff being down, all the money they were losing. Bring yourself back to that moment. Bring back that terror and that pain and that anger and use it to say, that's never going to happen again. I'm going to implement testing.
Wow. I mean, I have a lot of anger to harness, so that'll work well for me. What about you, Ben or Patrick?
Well, the docs aren't bad. Like, the docs are pretty good. They don't teach you necessarily how to test. They teach you how to get set up with testing in Craft, which is the starting point. I think Craft Quest is ideal because Ryan walks you through examples of how to write and run acceptance tests, and that's a great starting point.
Yeah, or just clone the Craft repo and write some tests for it and just see where you end up. Because I mean, it's something that most people, especially if you've done some kind of plugin development, everyone's worked with that. So otherwise, just submit a pull request with some basic tests and see what Brad says, because he'll often have really good feedback on it.
I would like to give
coaching.
Well, that's a great idea. Everyone should submit pull requests.
I would like to give a little pro tip, or maybe amateur tip is more appropriate. I was helping someone set up their testing framework recently, and I forgot to mention that they should use a new database to run the tests on, and they ran it on a database that was populated with real data. So Craft will, or when you run your tests, it will generate the database for you using the install migration, and then it will clean up as well, which means it'll wipe all of your data at the end. So it is a good idea to use a fresh database that you can throw away. And I guess the other thing I've found and I've been really impressed with is the integration, like the high level of integration that with Craft itself. So things like project config will still work, mailers you can mock, things that I talked about earlier like elements. So it's very easy to mock an entry because an entry is tied to a section and an entry type and a site, and it has an author, right? So you can very quickly generate a set of elements to work with. Kind of also, this may interest you, Andrew, actually. I've thought about how we can do performance testing using this. Because often when we test our stuff, we have maybe 2-3 users in the system, but it might be relevant to test our plugins in the context of a CMS that has, thousands of users and maybe thousands of related entries. And how does it work there? So it's very easy using fixtures to generate that sample content and then run our methods on those.
That's an interesting idea that I just thought of, and I don't know, I still haven't fully formed it, but Yi has the built-in capability to profile your website. It'd be kind of interesting if you built a test that automatically tied into that and would throw an exception or a fault or whatever if anything was taking above a certain amount of time. I mean, that would be kind of interesting. You would have kind of an automatic tripwire in there.
Codeception does some general kind of performance monitoring, so you get an idea of how long each individual test took and how how long it took to populate your fixtures and everything. And you can probably write a module, or maybe there's already one out there, that can really dive into giving you some high value performance metrics as well.
Yeah, well, what I mean is the profiling data that is already being recorded in terms of how long these database transactions took, in terms of how long it took SEO to render this. The test could do some introspection into that performance data and give you
that would be cool.
Yeah.
That would be awesome. Yeah.
I'm sure you could set that up relatively easily, because in the testing environment, you have full access to Craft and Yi application as well. And the profiler is just part of that.
Right.
I mean, what Ben says, that's important. I mean, when you work with Craft, either in functional testing or unit testing, it's like working with just a regular old Craft app object. So calling Craft app, it will behave pretty much entirely the same as you would on a production site.
Well, that about wraps it up for another episode of the devMode.fm podcast. If you'd like to have every episode delivered to your favorite player, you can subscribe via RSS or find us on iTunes or Google Play. If you like what we're doing, please review the show on iTunes. It's the best way to help others find the show. You can also follow us on Twitter at devModeFM, and we'd love to hear your thoughts on testing and on the plugin factory scaffolding, which is available now. Leave us a comment on devMode.fm website where we can continue the conversation. For the devMode.fm podcast, I'm Jennifer Blumberg.
I'm Andrew Welch.
I'm Patrick Harrington.
And thank you again to Ben and Giel for joining us today. I hope you guys learned a lot about testing.
Thank you. It's been fun.
Thank you.
You should have played your guitar.
Oh my God, yeah.
Such fail. Unbelievable. So we got to see Patrick's dad face. I don't know if anyone caught that, but his kids were doing something disturbing him. And
I'm sorry I've been quiet today. My 3-year-old's, I don't know where he is now.
We got to see his angry, pissed off dad face. That was amazing. That was amazing.
I like your background, though.